A brief cold rain ran across the rooftops, as if to remind us that the castle on the rock still ruled over the plain, and that at any moment people with pikes and bags for collecting taxes could come down from there. At that moment, the village elder of Kilbreck, the short and wiry Fergus, tucked a bundle of papers into his bag with a single movement, as if he were hiding embers that could start a fire, as well as the guards' torches. He knew that today would mark the beginning of what many were afraid to name. He decided that one ordinary day in the countryside would be the beginning of the end of the myth that had been used to blackmail them for years. I am glad to see you. I am a male voice, and it is important to me where you are watching me from. Write in the comments where you are listening to this story, and I wish you pleasant listening. Laird Stratcory, Lord of the Stone Fortress, announced to the villagers along the river valley that he had an ancient right to demand expensive gifts for every wedding. He referred to the customs of his ancestors and the fact that none of the common people understood the canons and formulas. With each new couple, he sent his steward, who wrote down the names in a thunderous book, made a note of the payment, and left a rough seal on the wax. People were accustomed to thinking that this was the way it should be, that it had always been this way. But Fergus could read and write a little, because in his youth, a monk from the nearest priory had taken him to school for several winter seasons. From that time on, the village elder remembered not only the Psalms, but also the strange, dry turns of phrase of the scribes, where each word was like a stone support under a bridge. He began by not attracting unnecessary attention. From the spring market, he returned not with grain and salt, but with copies of several charters from neighboring barons. He did not buy openly, but exchanged them for bundles of candle fat and sacks of oats, so that the paper's journey to the village would be smeared with trifles. He carved a thin cavity in the barn's beams and hid the bundles there, covering them with dry husks. He understood that the laird was playing on fear, and that fear concealed a simple idea. If a right is ancient, then it must be written in charters, as the monk had taught him. Fergus repeated to himself that true power loves silent signs, while false power always shouts about itself. His first assistant was a woman whom no one trusted, although they bought everything from her. Her name was Mora. She lived by the ravine and made candles. She always smelled of smoke and old wax, wore a worn cloak, and lowered her eyes when she met people. She was considered dark, and people whispered that she whispered unnecessary words over the wicks. But Mora had eyes that saw the flight of fine dust and the trail of a bubble in drying wax. When she examined the fresh seals on the letters of refusal, the compulsory redemption papers for young people, she noticed that the air bubbles were in the same place, as if the seal had been pressed on the same uneven board. She told Fergus that the pattern of bubbles was repeated, as if the hand had been pressed not against the parchment, but against a backing with a crack in the same line. She asked him not to reveal her words. Fergus explained that he would not tell anyone, because without her, it would all remain a rumor. So Mora, who was considered a nobody, became the one who found the key to the main thread. The second thread stretched from the priory of St. Ninian. There, scribes sometimes copied the charters of neighboring lords when they asked to have the formulas certified. In one such scroll, Fergus noticed a line that mentioned the baron's rights to bridge tolls and tithes on fish, but there was nothing about wedding gifts. He would have passed it by, if not for a small note in the margins. The scribe had marked that the formula had been agreed upon with a notary sent from an overseas city where law was taught. This meant that the formula was not disputed. Fergus asked the monk to show him more records, and the monk brought out 2 copies of sheets from different years. They were dry and faded, but there was not a single line about what the laird was pressing them for. Fergus realized that silence could also be evidence. Another thread lay at the headman's house, in a wooden box, where he kept memories of his brother. As a child, his brother had gone to work as a shepherd on distant slopes and got into trouble in winter. People from the castle picked him up and warmed him up. Later, warm clothes were sent to their house, marked as a gift of gratitude from an unknown friend. His mother said then that every debt has two ends. One is seen by the one who pays, the other by the one who receives. Fergus thought that there must be someone in the castle who remembered this old story. He tried to keep in mind that somewhere above there was a hidden connection between their house and the laird's people, even if it had been forgotten. Everything could have collapsed if it hadn't been for an incident that seemed like a trivial matter. Before the summer fair in Kilbreck, a cart appeared with barrels of dried resin for roof repairs. The cart belonged to a man from a seaside village. He said he was carrying cargo for the castle, and that on the way he had been instructed to leave one box with the bailiff because it contained bundles of parish records. Fergus accepted the box but did not open it. He carefully placed it against the wall of the barn and closed the bolt. During the night, 2 people broke into the barn. He heard a rustle and managed to enter from the other side through a small door. He saw a dark shadow leaning over the box. The shadow noticed him, rushed to the exit, and disappeared into the rain. At dawn, Fergus opened the box and realized that they had tried to lure him in. Inside was a parchment on which it was crudely written that the priory recognized the Lord's right to a special gift for each wedding. But the wording was strange, as if the person who wrote it had heard the words and did not understand their meaning. Fergus saw 2 mistakes in the margins that no monk would have made: an incorrect date and the omission of the witness's name. He realized that he had been framed with a forgery so that he could later be accused of possessing false documents. An ordinary cart and an ordinary box had turned a quiet country day into the beginning of a silent thriller. Now the case smacked not only of controversy, but also of an attempt to frame him. The next day, the laird's steward came to the village. He said that the master was unhappy, that someone was confusing the people with talk of rights. He repeated that the ancient order was above written documents, and that it had always been so in their region. He threatened that in the fall he would impose fines on those who evaded the wedding gift. Fergus did not argue with him. He said that there would be a fair in the fall, and that he would raise the issue at the meeting, as required. The manager left, noticing that someone had carved a small sign on the post by the well, a rough cup and scales. Fergus had already told several old men that at the fair they would have to put everything they had on the table, as if placing it on scales. By this time, a stranger from overseas had appeared at the priory. He called himself Edward of Flanders. He spoke in simple language and explained that he helped to confirm merchants' transactions. He did not look like a rich man because he walked on foot and wore a modest cloak. But he had a case with small knives, needles for laces, and marks used to check paper for punctures. He showed the monk and Fergus how the needle mark in one bundle was repeated in another if the paper was sewn on the same day. He said he could do it carefully and quickly because he was used to city markets, where time was precious. He was no friend of the village, but he turned out to be the one who could turn the tide of the dispute with a single decision. Fergus explained to him that in the valley, the Baron was oppressing the people with a fabrication. Edward said he was ready to confirm it if he saw the formulas with his own eyes. Thus came an unexpected benefactor, though no one had asked him. Fergus pieced together the clues as if he were building a dry stone fence. Mora's bubbles, the silence of the neighbor's charter, the strange box, and the flaws in the planted formula, the overseas assistant with needles. The most dangerous part remained, the public reading. He chose a day when people would gather on their own. It was a harvest festival, and a row of stalls selling sheep and dried fish was set up in the square. He sent a messenger to the Lord in advance, with a note informing him that the formulas on village taxes would be read at the gathering by the well. He added the dry thought that ignoring such a reading would be an admission that the master did not want to listen to the lawful words. By morning, the square was already noisy. Girls in homespun scarves were choosing ribbons. Young men were arguing about whose knife was longer, and old men were haggling over the price of salted herring. 2 benches were set up to one side. The monks' notaries from the priory sat on one, and the laird's steward and 2 horsemen sat on the other. Fergus stood between them. He took bundles out of his bag and marked each one with a cross to indicate where it came from the estate to the north, from the estate to the south, from the lands beyond the marsh. Edward stood behind, sharpening his needle on a tiny pebble, and had already noticed the equal distances between the holes in the lacing, as if the different sheets had been sewn with the same tool in the same workshop. He said that this spoke of order and the usual course of business. The steward clenched his teeth and crumpled his hat. Fergus began with the simple things. He recounted that in such and such lands they charged a toll for the bridge and for winter grazing, but never asked for a separate gift for a wedding. He said that in another estate, the owner reserved the right to a share of the catch if they fished in his pond, but did not record anything about a gift from each wedding. He did not read aloud, but listed the numbers as they counted sheaves. At this time, Mora placed 3 candles on the bench. In the first, still alive, the bubble sat at the edge like a fly. In the second, it repeated in the same place. In the third, it was in a different place. She said that such patterns occur when a handful of wax is melted on the same board with a chip. Edward nodded and explained that the seals on the laird's papers were also on the same crooked backing. This meant that the manager did not carry the seal to each newlywed, as was customary in official matters, but worked in one place, stamping a whole bundle of sheets at once. This was not a crime in itself, but it showed that this was not an ancient custom, but a new order devised for the convenience of the master. The people were buzzing, because even the simplest man understood that there was something fishy about the whole affair. Then the manager stood up and said that he had an extract in which the priory recognized the Lord's right to a special wedding gift. He took out a bundle similar to the one that had been planted in Fergus's box. The monk looked at the date and said that the wording was incorrect because it was not used in their lands. Edward pointed out that the witness's signature was missing a required stroke. Fergus said that someone had tried to slip him a similar scroll during the night. He described the cart, the coastal driver, and how someone had tried to carry away the box. He said he couldn't name names yet, but it was now clear that someone had planted a document with someone else's handwriting on it the previous night. The square fell silent. At that moment, there was a shift. From a melodrama about rural gifts, the story itself became like a chase in the dark, with a man lurking behind the yard. By noon, the laird himself had arrived at the square. He was wearing a cloak and had a face that had long been accustomed to power. The people were silent. He looked at the monk, the steward, and the bundles, and said that he would not tolerate unrest. He repeated that the order was ancient. Then Fergus brought out the last thing he had been keeping until that moment. It was a small bundle of cloth containing a thin board with a crack in it. Mora had found it at home when she was boiling old wax in a large bowl. This board was the very backing on which seals were pressed. The crack repeated the pattern of bubbles on the tax papers. Edward placed the seal on the crack and showed that the line was perfect. The monk said that this was not how it was done in the offices, because the seal was pressed on a flat board. Fergus calmly explained that a man from the castle often came to Mora's house for candles, and that once he had left this board by her hearth. Perhaps he was in a hurry. It was a minor household item, but it linked the seals to the crooked board and showed that the bundles had not been made in order. Instead of anger, the laird said that he had his own paper, confirming the right from afar. Then the monk asked for witnesses. The laird named a man from the priory, and then the veil was lifted. The man named by the laird was the very monk who had taught Fergus at school in his youth. He stood nearby and was a living witness. He said that he had never seen such a formula, and that his name had probably been entered without his knowledge. It was a blow to the face of authority. The people began to murmur, not out of anger, but out of surprise. The laird saw that the threads were pulling him to the edge, but he did not give up yet. At that moment, there was a turn of events that no one expected, although it had been long in the making. An old woman, quiet and rarely leaving her yard, came out of the crowd. Her name was Alice. She was holding a bundle of embroidery in her hands. She said through Fergus that many years ago, a boy from the castle had come to their house, hidden from the winter. She had given him a warm shirt. The shirt had a special pattern on the seam, which she only gave to her own. She had kept a piece of that fabric because it had her mark on it. Fergus thought it sounded like an empty story, but then he realized that the mark was rare and that it could be seen on the laird's cloak. The hem had the same barely noticeable thread, as if someone had once become accustomed to a particular method of darning and passed it on to the palace workshop. The old woman said that her son-in-law had told her that the master's son had frostbitten his hands that winter and had been rescued in the village. So the connection between the steward's house and the castle was not abstract gratitude, but a real past that came back like a boomerang. It was a hidden kinship in the broad sense, not blood, but kinship through debt and salvation. The laird stood and understood that in the eyes of the people, these threads were more important than cries of antiquity. The unexpected benefactor did not leave the scene either. Edward said that according to city customs, if the formula was not recorded in the charters of the neighbors, and if the scrolls with seals were made on the same curved board, and the name of the witness was entered without it, then the disputed part of the customs could not be considered recognized. He did not take the man by the hand, but showed him the path that city courts usually take to reach a decision. He suggested drawing up a new charter, listing the fees honestly: the bridge toll, the road repair fee, the number of fish in the pond, and leaving a blank space where the laird demanded gifts for the wedding. He said he was ready to unbind and rebind the sheets himself so that everything would be visible. The laird realized that either he would sign such a charter, or he would be remembered as the one who invented the law and forged names. He was silent for a long time, while the people began to exchange glances, settle on new prices in the rows, and wait for the end. Then he nodded. He said he was ready to approve the paper in the presence of 2 monks and 1 outsider. He wanted Fergus to choose the outsider, because that would be calmer. Fergus named Mora. The people gasped. The choice seemed bold, because she had always been shunned. But it was she who held the crooked board in her hands and showed the trail of bubbles. The laird wanted to object, but realized that arguing over such a trifle would look petty. He agreed. Thus, the underrated hero, whom many considered a nobody, became one of the 3 witnesses to the new document. It was a quiet turn, but the most powerful one, because it broke the usual hierarchy of views. By evening, the monk had written and read the formula. He used simple phrases so that everyone could understand. He listed that the village ceded the rights to the road and bridge to the laird, and the laird renounced the myth of special gifts for weddings. He added a line about checking the accounts once a year by candlelight at the well. He stipulated that any new levy must be brought before the assembly. He wrote down the signatures of the witnesses: the monk, Maury, and Edward. He indicated the date in words so that no one could tamper with the numbers. He affixed the priory's seal. Then Fergus made his last small request. He said he was not asking forgiveness for the disturbance, but asked that it be noted at the bottom of the paper that the bailiff would not be punished for reading the formulas and asking questions. The laird nodded, because refusal would now seem vindictive. So the paper became real. Instead of a victory cry, The people accepted it as a difficult but just end. People knew the value of a word when it was embroidered with even thread and lay on the table. The girls looked away because it was easier to breathe. The boys laughed not loudly, but fervently, as if a stone had been removed from their shoes. The old men said that one can live as long as it is written clearly. And Fergus felt his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He remembered his mother's words about duty, which has two ends. He held one end, the laird held the other, and now they had let go of the rope. At night, a man from the castle approached his yard. He was not hostile. He said that the box with the fake bundle was not the work of the master, but of one of the younger servants who wanted to curry favor. He asked Fergus not to bring this to the priory. Fergus did not respond in writing, but simply closed the gate and extinguished the lamp. He decided that the law had already written the answer and that it was not his place to seek revenge. A week later, life in the village returned to normal. The calf led its mother to the shallow water. The barrels of fish gave off the smell of salt, and the roofs smelled of resin again. But people acted differently. Now, when they discussed at the well who should go for stone for the road, they always brought Mora's candle and asked her to check the seal on the chest with the fees. She didn't smile broadly, just nodded, but everyone knew that without her eye there would be no straight line. She witnessed how facts were placed above shouting. She no longer seemed dark. The light in her house was on more often. People came to her not out of superstition, but because they had business. Fergus realized that different words were being whispered behind his back. Some called him a troublemaker. Some said that without him, everything would turn against the people. Some whispered that he had offended the laird. But when he passed by the fish stall, the old salt turned his knife over and tapped the handle lightly, just like on the first day when the guards came down to the fair. It was a quiet sign of respect. It was not a celebration, but it sounded deeper than a shout. In the fall, the last rye was harvested. An empty strip remained in its place. On it, the boy carved a word on the ground that only he could read. He wrote slowly, from memory, as Fergus had taught him. Don't rush, don't add anything extra. He did not write Latin phrases, but simple words about how there was now no such thing as a fictitious wedding gift in their region. A crow flew above him. It cawed as if trying to bring back into the air what was no longer on the ground. Fergus sat down on the step by the door, picked up the empty bag, and thought that his job was not to win, but to pull things that liked to hide out of the darkness in time. He knew that in a year there would be a new dispute. Maybe about hay, maybe about the right of way across the meadow, maybe about the price of salt. But now they had a paper with clear lines and people who knew how to check bubbles in wax. The second part began with the consequences of quiet events spreading further than could have been expected. In a village on the other side of the river, a young blacksmith heard about the gathering in Kilbreck and decided to get married without fear. He went to the priest, who wrote down their names, and everything proceeded as usual. But a day later, a new man appeared at the blacksmith's doorstep. He said that the laird from the neighboring lands to the east wanted to resume collecting the wedding gift because the custom was still observed in his domain. The blacksmith sent a boy to Kilbreck with a note. The note was short. It said that if written clarity had helped in one place, could the same be done in another? Fergus did not expect to be asked for help. He did not like other people's disputes, but he understood that if he left his neighbors alone, the old myth would lead to new stories about antiquity. He went to the priory, where the monk already knew how to sew sheets. Edward agreed to go with him, although he said he would soon leave for the port. Together, they entered the village across the river. Everything was the same there. It smelled of iron. Horseshoes lay on the blacksmith's anvil. People's hands went into the dark water to cool the steel. They held another reading, but this time the atmosphere was harsher. The master on the eastern bank did not want any clever words. He sent 3 young horsemen to take the bundles from the headman. Fergus said he didn't have the scrolls, but he had his memory and a mark on the bench where the seals could be checked. He didn't want to repeat the scene. He decided to do without the paper if they tried to take it by force. He talked about how some taxes were accepted in their valley and others were rejected. He did not refer to big names. He pointed to small things: a crack in a board, a straight needle, a simple date where words are subordinate to meaning. This time, there was no old woman eyeless and no bundles from last winter. But there was something else. The people themselves were ready to look at the letters without fear. Among the listeners was a girl named Isla. She was the miller's daughter. She was often overlooked because she was quiet and wore a rough skirt without ribbons. She held a bundle of wooden boards in her hands, with notches that resembled long, bony fingers. These were the mill's debt sticks. Isla claimed that she could read these notches as others read letters. She approached the table and laid out the sticks. She showed that the manager of the eastern laird had been at her house yesterday and had tried to bring in a new stick where the notches did not match the grain brought by the blacksmith's family. She said she could tell by the width of the knife cut. One hand was used to holding the knife differently. She showed that there was a clear substitution here. It was a twist of hidden talent against status. The girl, whom no one paid money to and no one asked for her opinion, resolved the dispute in 2 moves. Her eyes were like Mora's, only instead of bubbles, she saw knife marks. So 2 different ends of the valley came together in one set of actions: invisible work, precise details, simple clues. The owner from the East Bank tried to respond with force. He sent his men to retrieve the stick. They entered the mill yard, lifted the lid of the chest, and nearly broke the lid where the records of previous years lay. The usual domestic scene, people in boots, the sound of water, muddy boards, suddenly became tense. It was the second act of a domestic thriller. Not a night in a barn, but a daytime visit under the guise of an inspection. Danger hidden in supervision. Fergus did not raise a fuss. He did what he knew how to do. He asked the monk and Edward to stand next to him and list aloud the order of actions. What a witness is, what a record is, what a stick is. He gave Isla the floor. She recounted how the manager had tried to leave a new stick. Her simple words sounded heavy because no one expected such clarity from the silent miller's wife. She became another unsung hero of the day. The people looked at her the way they had looked at Mora yesterday. The eastern host could not withstand such pressure. He realized that if the people on his land listened to a girl who read sticks and a monk who stroked a needle, it would be easier to approve a written charter than to look for a fight. He agreed to draw up a list of fees without gifts for weddings. He asked Isla to be the witness for the people. This time, she sat quietly at the table, holding a knife that did not cut people or destinies, but only cleaned the edge of the stick so that the cut was visible to everyone. Edward wrote down a few simple lines. The monk put his seal on it, and the matter was settled. Returning to Kilbrec, Fergus saw at his doorstep the very boy who, as a child, had brought him water to school while the monk taught him to read. Now that boy was a man. He said he had heard at the fair that the mayor had become a troublemaker. Fergus just nodded. He didn't want to justify himself. He knew that his job was different, to hold the rope until the other hand let go. And then another thing came to mind. News came to the castle that in the distant lands to the north, a relative of the laird was arguing with the monks over the right to the forest. The laird unexpectedly sent the very steward who had shown the fake scroll in Kilbrec there. The steward left without saying a word. He was gone for many days. When he returned, people learned that there, in the north, he had recognized the monks' formulas and signed the paper honestly. It was as if he had been replaced. People asked why he had acted differently in the fall than he had in the summer. They said he was afraid of Edward. But the real reason was deeper and closer. It was again a hidden connection, like in the old story about the rescued boy. One night, the manager came to Mora. He stood at the threshold and asked for a candle. He said that his daughter had been born. He asked for a thin candle for the christening. Mora listened and gave him the candle. She asked why he had come to her when he had previously brought her a crooked printing block and had not even given her an extra piece of wax. He lowered his head. He said that his wife was the sister of that very Isla from the village on the east coast. He confessed that he had quarreled with his wife after the incident with the stick. He said he understood how quickly lies in business matters could turn a person into an empty shell. He asked Mora not to tell anyone. He said he was not defending the laird and would not defend Fabrications. It was a hidden kinship of a different kind. The world would have collapsed into a normal dispute if it weren't for the family thread that connected the enemy to those he was trying to deceive. Mora did not repeat his words to anyone. She simply brought a candle to the table, where the charter board lay, and dripped wax onto the edge. The bubble ran along the wax, but stopped immediately. She thought that some things could be corrected if stopped in time. The next morning, she told Fergus only that the manager had a daughter. That was enough to understand why a man who was ready to commit fraud suddenly became softer. The village immediately stopped berating him. It was not forgiveness. It was the understanding that a man's home is stronger than his loud posturing. Around the same time, the priory sent a new list to Kilbrec, in which the monks proposed a simple procedure for the future. Once a year, the elders of the neighboring villages gathered at the well, and each brought one sheet with the collections for the year. The sheets were tied with a single string, and Edward taught the monk to make small punctures with a needle at equal distances. It was a detail that no one in the village had noticed before. Now everyone knew about it. If someone brought a sheet with a puncture in a different place a year later, it meant that they had made a correction without consent. A simple needle became not a weapon, but a way to keep track of the overall score. There were many such small steps, and they were the essence of change. Laird did not lose face in the end. He found a way to preserve his dignity in front of the people. A month later, he sent baskets of salt and cloth for the priest and the priory, as if to compensate for what he had wanted to take before. He did not say a single loud word. He simply pushed the old crooked board away from the manager. He ordered it to be replaced with a straight one. If anyone saw weakness in this, they did not find it. If anyone saw a gesture in this, they saw it clearly. It was the very denouement where justice is built, not on shouting and humiliation, but on the simple choice of people in power to stop hiding behind a myth. Fergus spoke little about himself. He woke up at the usual time, went to the well, watched the water darken towards evening and lighten towards morning. He would sometimes take out an old piece of fabric with an Aeolus pattern from a secret place, and remember how one good deed in winter had saved a boy, and then that salvation had returned years later and intersected with letters, needles, bubbles, and sticks. He thought that the world was held together by such invisible bridges, where it was only a day's journey from one village to another, and only a human memory from the past to the present. Once, a boy approached him, the same one who had carved words on the ground. He said he wanted to learn from the monk, not only to read psalms, but also formulas. He said he wanted to be a man who stood between power and myth, holding a needle in his hand instead of a sword. Fergus gave him an old string that Edward had once given him. He said it was not a weapon or a decoration, but simply a string that held the sheets together so that no one could tear the meaning into pieces. Meanwhile, Mora continued to do her work. She made candles. Now she was asked more often for thin, light ones for reading by the well. She no longer heard the words about darkness behind her back. She knew the value of her eyes and hands. She knew that not every hero wears a cloak. Sometimes a hero is a woman at the hearth who notices a bubble in the right place. Her home became a place where people brought gratitude, not fear. Isla got hers too. Now her sticks were marked not only with notches for flour and grain, but also with neat notes from neighbors asking her to check their accounts. She wasn't proud of it. She just did what she knew how to do. It was quiet work, but it changed the way people looked at paper and words. When, after many months, news from the castle finally reached Kilbreck again, it was not a threat. It was an invitation to send the village elder to a council meeting, where the laird wanted to discuss road repairs. He proposed spending the taxes not alone, but together with the villagers. It looked like a concession, but it was more than that. It was a step toward the very clarity that Fergus had been fighting for bit by bit. He did not celebrate. He simply took the bag, put 4 blank sheets of paper and a piece of wax in it. He went to the castle, where the walls were cold, but the air no longer seemed so heavy. At the council, he told how they checked seals and sticks together in their valley. He said that the road was not a place for myths, but a place for feet and wheels. He proposed a simple scheme. Each farmstead would contribute a little labor, a little stone, and all of this would be recorded on a single sheet of paper. He proposed that there be 3 witnesses again: a priest, 1 person from the castle, and 1 from the people. As a sign of respect, he did not name himself from the people, but an old salt who was quietly tapping his knife on the handle. He was a man of few words, but he was respected. The laird agreed. At that moment, the people in the hall realized that the troublemaker was not seeking his own glory. He was giving way to another. This was moral clarity. Justice not as the distribution of generosity from above or retribution from below, but as the habit of recording what is, without dust, without myth, without shouting. When Fergus left the castle on a cold day, a flock flew overhead and landed on the wall. He looked up and thought that birds did not know what a charter formula was, but people knew how to keep their word. He returned to the well. Children laughed, threw pebbles, women rinsed laundry, men measured the length of beams for a new cart. Life returned to its usual course, but it was already different. A simple confidence had settled in. If someone mentioned the ancient law again tomorrow, they would have not only fear and whispers, but also a sheet of paper, a needle, a candle, a stick, and people who knew how to look up where they had previously looked down. Thus ended the story of the myth that was shattered by the text. It could not have ended otherwise, because its ending stemmed from the choices people made. Some decided to read, some decided to look, some decided to acknowledge. No one saved them by miracle. They saved themselves with steps, like steps on a wet road, short, firm, careful. And every time they took a step, they left behind a trace like a small letter. These traces now led in one direction. If you listen to the end, write in the comments where you are watching this story from, and how you feel when a familiar word suddenly turns out to be a fiction. I wish you a peaceful day and a clear head, like those who put the needle in the same place to hold the sheets together.